Right, well, we're back with part 2 of 911 to Armageddon with William Stuart. Where do we go now, William?
Right, well, we had an earlier question about the Armageddon theme in Iran. And what I said there was that the origin of that particular moment was a bit obscure, where the Armageddon theme came from. And what I mean by that is that I haven't really followed the whole of that particular one through. But what I would say is it's the Trilateral Commission of Rockefeller and Mr. Ball of Trilateral Commission and President Carter of Trilateral Commission who moved the Shah of Iran, made him run from his country in 1979. And so, in a sense, the origin of what has happened there to Iran is really based back in the same old sort of setup. As part of all this, there was a meeting of Rockefeller, secret meetings in 1942 in Canada to plan the European Union, and this was first outlined by Giuseppe Mazzini, a Lombard agent, in 1837. So 120 years later, they created the 1957 Meetings of Rome. First, we had Rockefeller secret meetings in 1942 in Canada to plan the European Union, and this was outlined first by Giuseppe Mazzini, called Giovanni Europa in 1837, and exactly 120 years later, it was the beginning of the European Union and the 1957 Meetings of Rome. The plans to take over Europe were organised by the CIA, or rather splinter group of the CIA, and which paid $4 million in today's money to bring it about. Attending that group in 1942 were those who would set up the Bilderberg Group, which went on to become the Trilateral Commission. So we know, roughly speaking, what we're dealing with. Then in 1952, these same bankers were on the move. Alan Dulles, a relative of Rockefeller, had created and was running the CIA, or rather a splinter group of it, and brother John Dulles had created the United Nations using an entirely communist committee to do so, although he was extremely right-wing. So we're looking at the Synergy Nazi communism that both of them are running. And then in 1952, these two brothers, Alan and John, were assisting the moves to remove Britain, France and Israel from Suez in around 1956, I think it was. King Farouk was deposed, then the British commander of the Arab League. And when Britain was about to take the canal back, Eisenhower, on the advice of the Dulles pair, threatened to cash in Britain's war bonds, thus bankrupting Britain. When Britain turned to the IMF, which is run by the Hitler Bank, the Bank of International Settlements, that request for money was blocked. So when you look at that, you see that the Muslim Brotherhood, which is now in power in Egypt, was a somewhat inevitable outcome of a whole process. Then came trilateral action, and the Shah of Iran fled in 1979. Once again, this is an irreligious cartel made up of the trilateral members, President Carter, Mr. Ball and Rockefeller, and of course others. But there you see Iran becoming a religious country, giving up the sort of security it had before to keep itself aloof from this emerging brotherhood.
Well, this sounds like a case of the West playing politics in the Middle East yet again, because we put the Shah in the first place, and now here we go taking the Shah out.
Yeah, that's quite correct. And we've got two particular forces at work. One is the more legitimate Western forces, the other, of course, is the bankers group. So you've got this interplay all the time, along with other pressures between what was called capitalism and what was called communism. So there's a lot of change and a lot of flow. But what I'm trying to look at here is the development towards something which I think we might recognize when we get towards the end of this. On July 3rd, 1979, Brzezinski, the trilateral member employed by Rockefeller, but that's employed by the banking cartel, paid for armed terrorism to begin in the world. They first of all armed the terrorists against the Marxist government of Afghanistan, knowing that Russia would come to the aid of that legitimate government. They were responsible for the deaths of many Russians, and once the Russians withdrew, they then turned their attack upon the rebels themselves. The rebels were armed, of course, through bin Laden, who at the time was working for the splinter CIA, and also the BCCI Bank of Rothschild. Manager Hartman was doing the supplying the bank being used for the various payments for arms. So Brzezinski, employed by Rockefeller, employed from Europe, so we're not dealing with America, we're dealing with these bankers who relate through to the Round Table in Britain and the Round Table in Europe, created the terrorism of the Middle East, which spread to 5,000 terrorists in Saudi Arabia, 3,000 in Yemen, 2,000 in Egypt, 2,800 in Algeria, 400 in Tunisia, 370 in Iraq, and 200 in Libya. Brzezinski was actually asked about this and the funding of terrorism, and he did himself admit that the attacks on the Marxist government and then on the Russians was part of his and the bankers' plan. And he was asked about all the casualties that had occurred, and he said, well, what is more important, the Cold War ending or a few stirred-up Muslims? Now, of course, by this time, the death toll from all these disturbances is beginning to rise alarmingly.
Well, people like Brzezinski, either they're mad as March hares or they're inherently evil and devoid of any humanity.
Well, you certainly start to think along those lines, don't you, as you begin to look at the Middle East full of lovely little families and lots of good people, and you begin to wonder. Another employee of Rockefeller, incidentally, Henry Kissinger, pushed for his clash of civilizations, axis of evil, arc of crisis. He was trilateral member and a servant, of course, as I said, of Rockefeller. And he made it clear that he was not speaking for the Bush administration, but a kind of rogue America and British alliance, which we've previously talked about, BAP. And he was set up in business by the Warburgs. Those are the ones who helped fund the Nazis, the EU, Russian Revolution. And this Afghan war really was never what it seemed. It was, if you like, Round Table from the start. We then moved from Afghanistan, which, I mean, was a disgrace, really, and we come to Iraq.
A lot of people think that the reason that we went into Afghanistan was because of the global pipeline and a whole variety of reasons, but it seems as though it was planned a long time before these ideas came to the fore. So what is the actual reason that they did go into Afghanistan?
Well, I think there are two reasons, and the first is that this is the old East India Company that we're talking about, which went trading with sword in hand, and they would look for the world's resources and then go for them. And there are some very rich resources to be had in that area. So there's one of the motivations. And those of you who like to try to trace the New World Order and think about that can see another very big slice of the world falling to a particular banking arrangement. I think the two motives are there. And this particularly applies, as I say, to the general activity going on in the Middle East, which is taking one country after another into the grip of the few. When we come to the Iraq War, and I've done some detailed work on this, on the large number of lies that were told, war was prepared and the media used to make it seem a reasonable activity. At the end of this Iraq war, terrorism itself had risen by 600% from just a handful of terrorists. I believe there are now 17,000. Madrasa schools, which are not the good ones, but the ones who are teaching jihad, run into the thousands and perhaps millions, where people are being taught hatred of the West. Saddam Hussein, who was very good at keeping the Brotherhood at bay, was hung. And now you can see you've got a very fluid situation created by these activities. If we move on to Libya, where again you've got Gaddafi making a stand against the Muslim Brotherhood. Like Saddam, he was murdered. Much of the press against him was organized by Black Flag operations. He didn't do a lot of the things that he's supposed to have done. And so, although dictatorship is not a good thing, and most would admit that, at the same time, democracy is being taught as if it were, in the words of somebody else, a cup of instant coffee whereby you just put in hot water. Democracy takes 50 years, 60 years, 100 years to really develop. And what's happening here is crude intervention in these countries, which are then left in an awful state, and the policies of gain and the policies of power being conducted very secretly.
Yeah, on the subject of Iraq, I think we have to remember how the mainstream media played it, and how they spun it was by repeatedly saying weapons of mass destruction. So it really got into people's heads that this was a justifiable war.
Yes, in fact, there are 17 quite major lies deliberately told to start that war, and I have listed them. And when you get down to the end of the list, you think, my goodness me, what's happened to democracy? And why is nobody being brought forward to answer questions about all this? But there you go. Yes, indeed, it was a shocking, illegal war. So when we stand back a bit now, we're looking at radical politics with Britain, France, and Israel out of Egypt, the Shah out of Iran, the Marxist government and Russians out of Afghanistan, Saddam out of Iraq, Gaddafi out of Libya, and unfortunately that's not even the end of the story. Now, all of these elements were very good at holding the Muslim Brotherhood in check. And I'd like you just to think back to Conti and Mazzini, agents who spent their lives making sure that the Muslim Brotherhood united one country after another and became a significant force. So you see, we're actually back in that 1700s and 1800s mode in the Middle East. And so we've got all these faces that are covered, rebels who are obviously being paid by somebody, the Al-Qaeda flag flying in just about every event that has happened, and the sense that we're moving on to something really quite bad.
Are there any connections between the trouble in the Middle East and the same bankers who funded the Russian Revolution?
Well, that's a particularly good question, and I think what I'm going to do, if I may, I'll leave that for a little while, and we'll come back onto that. What I'd like to look at is the event of 9/11 itself and see whether that's a genuine attack from overseas or whether it's something else, so that we can then tuck that one away and say it appears to be perhaps a doorway to all these disturbances, and then we can look at who has been responsible for the disturbances themselves. So if you like, I'll say a little bit about 9/11. 8:45 September 11, 2001, and Flight 11 out of Boston slammed into one of the towers. And we all know the carnage and the horror that was to follow that. When we begin to look at the event of 9/11, there are quite a lot of surprises. For instance, a team called Able Danger, made up of rather orthodox intelligence, had found the flyers and Mohammed Atta, the supposed leader of it all, in January of 2000. They were blocked by the FBI, by military intelligence, and told not to investigate. Senator Spector asked the Pentagon Chief of Intelligence what had happened to the large amounts of documentation on the Atta team, and he said it was all deleted. He was asked the question again, he just said, yeah, we deleted it all. When one of the actual flyers turned himself in, he was sent home. Somebody called Randy Glass also found out about the towers and wrote to Senator Graham. He was told they knew all about the planes, although planes had not been mentioned by Glass. When Glass wrote in again, he was told to keep quiet.
When you say one of the flyers, were you talking about a supposed terrorist?
Yes, indeed, the team that was supposed to have flown the planes into the towers.
And he was presumably sent back to his native country?
Indeed. Now, it's pretty certain that these terrorists, who were supposed to be flying big jets, had no flying skills at all. And yet, when you look at the event of the plane striking the towers, it's obvious that whatever was flying them, or whoever was flying them, had to be extremely skilled. So we start turning up a few little problems here. At the time, there were airliners being flown by radio control. They just developed that in the early parts of 2001. So the question is whether, in fact, there was a bit more going on. And the GPS signal around the towers was at level 10 and not at 4 as usual. So this is a very strange event, suggesting something very important was being played out. But then we have to add another little complex bit in that aircraft do not bring down steel buildings, and the aircraft are, in a sense, irrelevant to what happened, although they did provide a mask for the real perpetrators. When you've got a steel cage building which is proofed against fire, it doesn't come down when an aircraft hits it. As well as the Arab team from Saudi Arabia, the flyers themselves, there were plenty of Israeli activity. It's probable that the young movements, Hamas and for Israel Irgun, was the source of two teams operating in America. But it's not entirely certain that they are to be seen as the prime culprits for what happened. Israelis and Arabs from Saudi Arabia might have been part of the demolition of these buildings, but of course something else exploded in the Twin Towers, according to those who have looked under the surface. An Israeli phone, in fact, moved out of the Twin Towers a week before the strike, and at least 2 Israelis we know were warned 2 hours before the event. So there's an awful lot of knowledge about A retired Israeli Defense Force officer heard the Twin Towers strike being discussed in a Jewish cemetery in October of 2000 and told the FBI. So there are lots of things going on here, a certain amount of common knowledge and definite scientific doubt about the outcome, which was the fall of those towers. It's also been noticed that at the Trade Center there was a van and 3 Israelis were standing on top of it and dancing for absolute joy as the towers collapsed. So there was this sort of feeling that somehow it might be like the Ergun looking forward to rapture and the sort of Armageddon scenario that brings forward the state of Israel. But again, we're only just looking at these things and trying to make sense of what on earth was going on. Peshenik, the Patriot Games character who became Jack Ryan on the film, advisor to 5 presidents, stated 9/11 was to mobilize into war. The military responsible are known to me and I to them. The CIA, Wolfowitz, Cheney, Hadley, Ross, Rice, Air Force generals, Intel, CIA ops were involved. It was a false flag, a lie, and the 9/11 commission that looked at it was just nonsense. Cheney, Rumsfeld, Rice should have been put on trial with Abrahams and Wolfowitz and more. He stated on radio and TV that he wanted a trial at which he would give testimony. Now he's on film, he's on radio, and so you have to put that into the mix of what is going on here. He stated that if FBI agents got close, they were blocked by their bosses. So in other words, an insight into what happened with intelligence services at this time, that they were being blocked in certain ways, probably towards the top, if not at the top, but they were doing their job as you would expect them to do. Now, the CIA had an asset called Susan Lindau, and she was locked up for a year following these events and was very nearly given a chemical lobotomy to suggest that she was mad. She was basically just under the various laws that had been changed there, was just locked up like that and taken out of commission. And her boss, according to her, was bribed with millions to keep quiet. And she stated very clearly that a thermite bomb was used on the buildings and that this was a USA military weapon, not that somebody else might have one, but it was a very special kind of weapon, highly advanced and does not get into buildings unless it is placed there. Now, she was quite senior in her way. She was chief asset for Iraq, Libya, Yemen, Syria, Egypt, Malaysia. And she was told to tell Saddam Hussein months before 9/11 that if he didn't say who was behind the 9/11 plot, he would be bombed back into the Stone Age and hit harder than ever before. As Susan pointed out, he wanted peace and had opened up massive trade deals for America. So we're beginning to see another side of America. You're beginning to see a person who really, I suppose, invented PSYOPs, Peshenik, and you're beginning to see a senior CIA asset speaking on radio, speaking on film, on video, and saying something that many of us will not have heard.
When you just mentioned America, we're not talking about the American people. We're talking about that part of the American structure, the government, etc., that has been taken over by the globalists.
That is very true. And we have to keep that in mind all the time, that when you get these peaks of power in America, it goes straight across into places like Frankfurt and Switzerland. So let's say that America is responsible for what happened in America. It's much more complex than that. And it's beginning to look very much as though this ghastly event was arranged by people who were only using America for their own purposes. And thank you for clarifying that, because I think that's very important. Now, in the towers, there were hundreds of witnesses to explosions. And you've only got, in fact, I've put quite a lot of them in the book, but you've only got to look at that to realize there's something terribly wrong here. This included the police and the fire services, and some of these explosions were very clearly witnessed. There are 3 firemen, and they're on tape suggesting that there was an explosion in the lobby. They said it was horrible, and they were asked, was this a secondary explosion? And they said, yes, there was definitely a second explosion. On our way upstairs, the whole thing blew. There were 3 explosions after the plane hit. Now, police, firemen, civilians, news all said the same thing, and indeed there are actually recordings of explosions in the buildings. So buildings do not collapse because a plane hits them, and steel does not give way when treated against fire, as in the case of the Trade Center buildings. In any case, the towers fell into their own footprint in complete freefall, so someone took out the basement network of steel girders. Otherwise, this would not happen. Danish scientist Niels Harrit, Copenhagen University, found nanothermite material attached to the Twin Tower wreckage. This material melts metal and blows it apart, so it's both an explosive and it also melts it. He found tiny red chips of unreacted thermite, just as Susan, that's the CIA asset, had said. These bits had not gone off, and the city department staff stated the steel was bursting into flames, welding itself onto other steel, flowing in channels and pooling, and even melting the workers' boots. So 9 scientists found thermite as unreacted pyrotechnic explosives. Kevin Rahn lost his job as a lab director for writing a report that said aircraft fuel could not have done it. And when we look at Building 7, this was a planned demolition. The building moved inward at the top and collapsed at high speed into its own footprint. It was in freefall, which meant all its central columns had been taken out. It wouldn't do it otherwise. You might get some odd circumstance whereby a little bit of the building came down, but this went straight down into its footprint. It was timed in seconds and it was a complete freefall. Many people have written about this and have been completely ignored.
This might be new information for a lot of people, and they may not realise that Building 7 was actually not hit by a plane at all.
Yes, this is correct. And they may have seen or may not have seen the tape where it is stated that a farmer was saying the building will be coming down, appeared to be giving a countdown, and then said quite audibly on the video, "Run for your lives." This is recorded, of course. Then there was a huge boom that buckled the windows and shook the ground. So I would agree with what you're saying. There was a fire could burn for days on end and not actually bring the building down. The damage it received was not particularly bad, but that's not what happened, is it? The building had no steel network at its base and just went down into its own footprint. And the seconds of the fall have been properly gauged. So there we come up with lots of different ideas, but I think the whole thing is beginning to point to something else. And so, in a sense, you need the book to see what I've said and to see whether the reasoning is correct or not. I can only sort of skate over things as I am doing. And then we come to the Pentagon. And, if one bit of 9/11 wasn't quite correct, then possibly all of it isn't quite correct. Flight 77 is supposed to have flown into the Pentagon, but it left no proper debris. There's no engines. They were huge, of course. No engines. Seats, tailplane missing. Bodies, they're missing too. The engines would, in fact, on the flight path it was supposed to be on, would have ripped up the lawn. The wings themselves would have torn into the building, which, if you look at photographs of it, you'll see there are no marks of any wings there at all. So the whole thing is beginning to look extremely shaky. It was very clearly not on the flight path suggested by the black box. In fact, many reliable people, from Flowers to police, saw this Flight 77 on a different course altogether, and the plane was seen by a policeman as it flew away from the Pentagon anyway. Now, we know that 2 objects hit the Pentagon. One was thought to be an unmanned drone, which seems to have struck slightly after a very bright flash, possibly a rocket strike, with the great possibility that explosives also were in the Pentagon and set to destroy various records of trillion-dollar fraud. All the films of this event have disappeared, and now you know how many security cameras you have around these sort of areas. Only one film has been handed back, as far as I know at the moment, and experts have said that the frame or frames have been removed, so that the object that actually struck the Pentagon could not be identified. Now, all these things have got to be sort of thought out, and you have to ask the question why people would be wanting to hide this if they themselves have nothing to hide.
Yeah, I'd just like to bring in a couple of points. The first, you just briefly mentioned about a fraud. It was announced the day before that they had lost $23 trillion. And surprise, surprise, that all got forgotten the next day with 9/11. And the second thing I'd like to point people towards is Jesse Ventura did a very good episode on the Pentagon on his conspiracy series. And he had an eyewitness on who was actually working in the office that was hit. And she walked out through the hole in the wall that was made by supposedly the plane, and her first thoughts were that a bomb had gone off because she saw no plane debris. So I would suggest that people watch that film. It should be still out there on YouTube.
Yes, thank you for that. Those are very good points. Aeroplanes actually do not make neat holes in concrete, and something had gone through 12 layers of concrete, making a neat hole. So obviously things have been concealed. A very well conducted investigation showed that the plane was supposed to have cut through some lampposts which were just lying on the ground where they fell. And one of these lampposts was supposed to have gone through a taxi's front window. Now, the question is, were the lampposts planted to show a sort of bogus flight path? The taxi driver, in explaining that a large section of light post went through the front windscreen, was unable to explain why his car bonnet was unmarked, or why he was photographed at the time in an area where he said he was not, and why he kept changing his story. When he thought he was not being recorded, he said this: "It's not the truth, it's his story. It has nothing to do with the truth. It's too big for me, man. It's a big thing. You know, this is a world thing happening. I'm a small man. I'm not supposed to be involved in this. This is for other people, people who have money. I'm in it. We came across the highway together." So he is questioned. "You must have planned it." "It was planned," he said. "When people do things and get away with it, it's going to come to me. It's too big. I can't do nothing. It has to be stopped in the beginning." So now we're beginning to see sort of events which, frankly, should have gone to the 9/11 Commission and should have been resolved there. There's an awful lot of evidence which has simply been shoveled to one side to tell a very one-sided story. And I would say, that just as has been commented on just now, that Building 7 that came down, a clear demolition, had within it many files and documents on massive frauds. And here in the Pentagon, the bit of the Pentagon that was working on these huge frauds, as we've heard, sums of money that can't really be imagined. They're too big to be imagined, just massive, massive, massive sums of money. The investigation was going on in the department that was blown up. In the book, there is a picture of a pointed object at ground level heading for the Pentagon. It's not a traditional plane because it's too close to the ground and is assumed to be a radio-controlled drone. It's not a very good picture, but you'll see the point of it and wonder what it is. And then there's a smoking trail, which I've also put in there, which is the trail of one engine, which you would expect to find on something like a radio-controlled drone, which is just an aircraft being controlled in where it goes. And in that particular picture that I release, indeed someone has taken out a certain amount of information before it was released. Looking at it, there does appear to be a flash from the Pentagon before this drone gets there, suggesting a rocket strike and explosions within the Pentagon, or indeed both. Two rocket and radiation experts confirmed a rocket strike in their opinion, and the use at the Pentagon of depleted uranium. As with Building 7, which housed records of massive frauds lost in the fall of that building, so the part of the Pentagon hit held records, computers and people looking at trillion-dollar fraud. Even at high-speed crashes, passenger liners leave their tail, engines, seats, bodies, fuselage sections. But when you look at the photographs, well, there aren't any. Just small debris and a possible small engine. Now, Rumsfeld, when he was making a speech at the Pentagon, did make a slight mistake when he said a rocket hit the Pentagon, but there have been no words since. The Truth Society, made up of many experts, has been ignored by the press and media and officials, which says a great deal about the loss of freedom of speech in democracy today. There is professional disagreement about the destruction of 3 buildings and damage to a 4th. People do not blame American leadership, but they do feel they're being taken for a ride and that the old untouchables are in their country. Moshenik, intelligence and presidential advisor, has named who he thinks is responsible for the problems from within the American administration, which is not the same thing as saying America. Firemen and police have described an inside job and destruction that clearly has little to do with aeroplanes or lesser bombs, although they may have been used.
Yeah, if a missile or a drone went into the Pentagon, then what happened to the original plane? I know we've got a guess at this, but that plane had numerous passengers on, so presumably they had to eliminate them somehow or some way.
Well, I haven't, in what I'm saying, haven't sort of entered into speculation about anything very much. It seems to me that what we're dealing with is obvious facts that need to be discussed and sorted out. There was an Operation Northwood in America made up of senior chiefs who wanted to have an invasion of Cuba and an excuse to do it. And what they did do there was fly a passenger liner towards Cuba, then substituted for it with a drone. And the aircraft itself was then flown back to a base, an intelligence base. Operation Northwood was put forward by the military, and it was turned down by President Kennedy, so it never actually took place, but it was on paper. Now, I can't obviously speculate what happened after the aircraft was seen flying away, but you have to leave a few little things hanging in the air, and that, in my view, needs to be investigated along with a whole lot of other very unfortunate events. The Japanese Parliament discussed all this, and they said, aircraft don't do these sort of things to buildings, and concluded this is all very weird. So there are a lot of questions in the air, and really it's time for the matter to be reconsidered again, I think. This is what Rockefeller said. He stated that some believe we are part of a secret cabal working against the best interests of the United States, characterizing my family and me as internationalists and of conspiring with others around the world to build a more integrated global political and economic structure, one world, if you will. If that's the charge, I stand guilty, and I'm proud of it. Now, it's in that area, not necessarily this person, but it's in that area that I think we should be beginning to look for some answers to all this.